Hi everyone, this video is yet another one about those invisible things that really make it that much harder for a student to transition to university. But I hope that this one's particularly useful because it's also about something that tends to make it a lot more challenging for parents and caregivers as well, and that is communication with university. So as someone who used to be a full-time permanent school teacher, part of my job would entail actually proactively reaching out to parents and caregivers when the students in my class were finding things challenging. And that could be from something like students being reluctant to attend class, to finding the content challenging, to not participating in class very much, all the way through that gamut to perhaps things like failing an assessment task, which could have some quite significant consequences depending on the year level that they're in. And the useful thing about that is a lot of parents would see that as a team relationship where the student was really benefiting because the teacher and the parents and caregivers were all on the same page and always up to date with what's happening in that child's life. And that is as it should be when we're talking about somebody who's underage. Now, it's really interesting though, as a school teacher, I would teach 18-year-olds, so adults in Year 12, and as a lecturer, a senior lecturer now at university, I also teach 17-year-olds who are in my first year uni classes. So I think we see this really sharp delineation and we say, okay, well, these people are at university, they should be independent learners, and certainly there's scaffolding, and we obviously are hoping that students will breach that gap and eventually get there, but it's quite hard when you have a really sharp transition. So the challenges at university that, it might be that I teach many hundreds of students, and so I can't possibly proactively reach out to parents in the same way I did when I taught perhaps 120. But the other actually really important thing is we have the Privacy Act here in Australia, which actually prevents any university staff members proactively contacting parents and caregivers about anything unless a student already gives us their consent. So whilst I was a school teacher and I had that constant stream of information going to parents such as yourselves, I can't actually do that at university. In fact, I'm not permitted to. So it can be really challenging for parents because, as a lecturer, I know that many of my students don't attend all of the learning activities. And that might be something that sounds really shocking to a parent who's used to their child going to every single class. Whereas the reality, I would say these days, is most students aren't attending a lot of things. And that might be fine, they might be able to be successful, but if that's something you're concerned about when you're thinking about your child and their independence, it's actually something that you might never know anything about unless your child is proactively telling you now, rather than relying on their teachers to do the same thing. That's also true of things like assessment tasks. I mean, a student might not realise that they have missed an assessment task themselves, but even if they do realise it, or they fail a particular assessment task or even a whole unit, it's not true to say that you would necessarily be told about that. You might actually have to rely on your child telling you that. If you would like to, I've got a couple of videos about whether it's possible to accidentally fail a unit. Unfortunately it is. And I've also got a video around, is it possible to think you're at the end of your degree and actually not be permitted to graduate? So there's some really useful information in there for both parents and students that I really highly recommend you have a look at. But essentially it's a really important thing for a parent or a caregiver to understand that hopefully as a family you'd want to be having that conversation before your child started attending university as to what that communication and what those expectations should look like. The other thing that I would say is challenging is oftentimes I deal with students who perhaps weren't aware of just how much they were benefiting from that proactive communication between staff, their teachers, and their parents when they were at school, because they don't see most of it. A lot of it's invisible, and that those people working in that team can then help that student. But when that communication is suddenly absent, thanks to the Privacy Act, obviously those people are no longer getting the benefit of that. So again, it's really well worth having that conversation beforehand. I will say parents are very welcome to be involved in their child's education at university. The only thing that university staff have to be sure of is that is being led by the student. So I have plenty of meetings where students will actually ask their parents to be involved because it might be about course advice or career decisions or challenges they're facing, and that's absolutely fine. But I can only permit it if the student themselves is the originator of that communication and that invitation for their parent to come in. So we need them to be emailing us and we need them to be CCing a parent onto that communication. Similarly, many of you may have children who have additional needs, and all universities will have some kind of mechanism whereby as long as the student gives their consent up front and signs a form, that the university can then make sure they're proactively including parents on communication. So if that's you and your family, that's the boat that you're in, please go to the individual institution and they will absolutely be able to help you with that. The last thing I'd say is if you're a parent thinking about a child, or if you yourself are a young person who's off to university for the first time, The other thing that's really challenging about this is the Privacy Act also means that we can only disclose personal information, so confidential information, if we know for sure who we're talking to. And I get a lot of students who email me, particularly when they're stressed, asking for help, but unfortunately they use a personal email address. And for me as a convener, if I can't tell exactly who I'm talking to, I can't disclose any information. So I oftentimes get emails from students, particularly if they're feeling quite anxious, and it might be about assessment tasks or confirming what particular learning activities they're enrolled in. Can I come to this lab at this time? Can I have an extension for this task? I've got a particular illness, or here's a medical certificate, or can you talk to me about the latest assessment task and my marks? And I would say none of those things are things I can share information about unless I can be certain I'm talking to the student. And the way that I manage to do that is by making sure that student is emailing me from their university email address. So the take-home messages from this email or this video I would say, is that the student needs to use their own university email address whenever they're contacting staff. And it's a really good idea for students and their families to have a conversation beforehand around communication about the person's study and how that's going to look. Hopefully this is a useful video for you. Many of you may not have been aware that that's the case and that it might have such a large impact. We know, unfortunately, that 1 in 5 university students in Australia completely drop out of their studies, never to complete them, and that a number of years ago, the average cost of an incomplete degree was $12,000. And obviously we don't want that to happen. There isn't really a good reason for that to happen, so I really hope that this video is one of many that can help you out. Happy study.